Well, thank you for that grand introduction. I'm a bit nervous now that I think that I should probably be really pessimistic or something just to not fulfill that intro. But it's great to be here. Tonight, the theme of my talk is crafting authenticity. The first time I kind of talked on this topic was in 2014 at Typo San Francisco. And since then, it's kind of evolved a little bit further. But basically, you know, the idea of authenticity in typography or hand lettering is something that I never really thought about at the initial kind of first stages of my career. But in the last kind of 5 to 10 years is like a buzzword in the marketing industry. Everything has to be real, everything has to connect with humans in a particular way. And part of the reason is because we're moving so far into the digital world that kind of brands want to cling on to something that's a little bit human. And in some instances, they do that through lettering and typography. So today my talk is going to kind of follow through my journey from being a passionate amateur student interested in typography to kind of the world that I'm in today, which is working pretty much every day drawing letter forms. So I guess the other side of crafting authenticity, which is like these brands wanting to grab onto this idea of something real, is that as an artist, how can you continue to create something that is truly real if it's continually being commercialized or used to sell something? How is it that something can still be real to you or to your practice, whether it's through the process or the content? And when you're working purely with typography and the words, it might be through the story or it might be through the form, and that's basically what I want to talk through today. So we're going to watch this video. Now this was a video that went viral like 2 or 3 years ago, and all it is a couple of dudes painting a bus stop sign. Look at him go, he's painting a bee in a single stroke. It's incredible. It is. So this video went viral 2 years ago. These are just guys, this is their trade, you know, and back in the day, everyone kind of learnt lettering and typography. People come to my workshops and say, oh, Gemma, I learnt calligraphy. And this is just part of their job, you know, there's nothing fancy, no brands are trying to make the process video behind the scenes of this kind of procedure of writing bus stop on the road, and yet they do it so effortlessly. And this, to me, is like the idea of authentic craft, you know? It's real, it's true, the essence of what it is, the process of making it, the person making it is there, and it's incredible. So then we transform, like fast forward to today, and you think about the world that we live in and the technology that we have. This is a calligraphy robot in Japan, which has been trained to create the strokes with pressure, movement, direction, all the characteristics. The way that it works is that you basically use it to draw the order of the strokes in the way that you normally would the character, and then it remembers what you did and does it by itself. Now, this kind of technology, you know, it's pretty incredible. It's not like it's something we use every day, but it's there and it's available. This is another calligraphy robot. They're everywhere. Look out, this one's from Germany. Basically, it was designed by this big robotic company, and it's set up to handwrite with its robotic arm. It's rewriting the whole Bible in black letter script in calligraphy. So obviously the technology is there to have machines to do something that is inherently human. This was Margaret Atwood. She at one point couldn't go on a book tour to sign because she had so many different locations to go, so she got a robot to do her signature for her. And I think there were lots of fans that were kind of annoyed because they wanted the real experience there. But it starts to, you know, put the question out there of what is something that's real and authentic. If you looked at that without seeing the process that it was made, would you even know that it wasn't her? Would you know that it was a robot? And then, so how does this translate into kind of advertising and brands today and your practice as an artist? So every day, pretty much the most common form of communication we have is text messaging. Now, this is a real picture I took of my dad when he first got his iPhone. I'm like, Dad, what's that? He's like, I'm just sending a text message. Aside from the fact that it's completely incomprehensible, I don't know what's he writing, it's massive. And he's like, oh, I can't read it because it's so small. I've got to put the font size up, it's so big. And this was like, I didn't even know that was an option at the time. But obviously the way that we communicate is changing. And It's, you know, it's becoming faster, it's becoming something that's immediate, it's becoming something where our language doesn't have to be as perfected, it can be really casual, and that's completely acceptable. And as a result, so many things are changing in the ways that we present letter forms and words. We have a whole entire new language, emojis. Like, no one can deny, like, this is the new set of emojis that recently came out. That's like expanding our language set. You can just send someone a picture of a taco. It's like going back to hieroglyphics. It's amazing and it's so cool, right? So this is kind of the world that we're living in. We've got so much kind of new technology that's facilitating communication, that's facilitating the way that we talk, the way that we express ourselves. We're kind of like at this peak. Nothing like this has happened since Gutenberg, you know, years and years ago, and it's almost like the opposite of that. We're going from this kind of print revolution to something which is oral, which is immediate, which is visual, multimedia, and so this is creating a whole new kind of world for typography and lettering. The other thing that's happening is that type is in the world. It's very present, so much so that when IKEA changed their kind of standard font inside their advertising from Futura to Verdana, people were angry. And there were news articles across the New York Times, and it's like, font war, you know, it's like, this is a big deal. And typography, like people who are really interested in typography were like, this is, how could you? Like, this is changing the brand. Futura is something that represents high design. Verdana was a web font, and this is making the news. Now, when I first started studying kind of design, typography was super nerdy and not mainstream at all, and that was less than 10 years ago. So the speed at which this is kind of changing is so fast. Celebrities are tweeting about fonts. This is like, you know, this is a big deal. And the other part of that is that, you know, with this kind of increase in self-expression, the tools that anybody can kind of create design, is that we have just this influx of inspirational quotes, hand-lettered. It's the rise of the amateur. So it's basically like, you know, I was an amateur when I got into typography, but the way that I kind of approached it was wanting to learn the skills, wanting to kind of, you know, learn the craft. But the way that we are kind of trained to think now is so fast that what we do kind of get on the other side of this speed with the rise of the amateur is like just an influx of not very good lettering and typography. On your Instagram every single day, there's an inspirational quote in like poorly hand-lettered, but it still feels real in a way. Sometimes handwriting that might not be, you know, crafted typographically well can still connect. So where do you kind of find the in-between between something that's real, created by someone that feels something, and something that's crafted by a professional designer? Seb Lester is he's probably the most highly followed calligraphers on Instagram. 628,000 people follow him on Instagram to watch him handwrite in different calligraphic forms every single day. It's the rise of the celebrity in every form. There's celebrity chefs, there's celebrity designers, there's celebrity pimple poppers. I got sent today by my boyfriend an Instagram account with like 300,000 followers, and every day he like pops a blackhead, and that is a thing that we want to see, and it's like, what is going on? But the thing is, this is all part of being human, and as we've kind of increasingly moved into this digital world, everything's on a screen, everything's a fixed size, you have to fit your messages into this kind of length. We're kind of hanging on to the things that make us kind of real and different. So what it means, I guess, also for practicing designers is that they're finding these new ways of differentiating themselves. If everyone can access kind of Photoshop, Illustrator, these new kind of tools. This is Eric Marinovic from, he's based in Brooklyn, and he did this project that went viral where he basically hand-lettered envelopes, and they were just beautiful lettering, and had a huge reception. And what is it about that? If he'd just done it on in Illustrator, what is the difference between making it something that's real or something familiar, something that has a sense of scale when you see it on the screen? You know the kind of humble envelope. So that's kind of one approach that designers are doing. Another one is this example here from Timothy Goodman, where he did this project called Memories of a Girl I Never Knew. And it was essentially a series of stories of girls in real life, stories that he'd met, dated, and they were real stories. So designers are kind of having to look into their personal bank of history to find new ways of communicating, new ways of making something that connects with people that might not be coming from a big brand, but something that you can kind of start your own project. And this is handwriting. Obviously it's designed, but it feels real, it feels authentic in a way. So this is where I kind of fit into it. This is the context of the world that we're in. And as I mentioned before, 10 years ago, I wouldn't have even known, one, that the job of a typographer or artist specializing in lettering would even exist, let alone it was going to be my job. So today I'm going to kind of talk through the journey that I went through from, studying to working in kind of bigger design firms and then finally going out by myself. Now, often people ask, Gemma, was your handwriting really good when you were a kid? I would say no, based on this example here. I think my stories were quite good. Cricket is a sport, people can do sport. It could be swimming, soccer, running, sports day has lots of sports. So I guess, there was something there. But even though my handwriting wasn't very good, I did like to make these little books. There was Bert's book of how to make fruit salad, which just listed a series of fruits that you would put in the fruit salad. And then there was Violet's Party, which I think was, it was probably my peak of the children's books, as I got the Principal Award and an excellent sticker up there, as you can see. The lettering in the spacing in Violet's Party is a little bit off. Violet's a bit tight, there was something there. So I loved kind of making these little stories and drawing. I was interested in art, but without having, I didn't have a dad that was a printer. I didn't have someone in my life that was anyway typographic. So I don't really know where the seeds of that were planted. Basically, fast forward, I guess this is probably 8 years ago. This is my 21st birthday party. It was Come As Your Favourite Font. I was Belle Gothic with all the black, but these shirts that we were wearing were the backup shirts for people that didn't come in costume, and they said Helvetica fuck yeah. So it was kind of like the default backup if you didn't have another option. So this was like the peak of my nerdiness, but the best costume was this guy that came in like a full white spacesuit. And I'm like, what are you? He's like, I'm Impact. So it was very, very nerdy. But before this happened, I actually studied law. So I kind of dropped out of law school after a year, realized I needed to do something more creative, moved to Sydney and started studying design. At the time, typography was taught in university as something that was very kind of rule-based. It was like, you never mix this font with this font, this is your line spacing way. And it was really boring and I just wasn't interested at all. But that was until I had an experience in a letterpress studio. So I had the opportunity to set type by hand. So as some of you, I'm not sure if anyone's experienced this before, I guess it's not as easy to come across nowadays, but you basically would have each individual letter was a piece of metal. And so suddenly all the rules made sense to me. It was like a space was a physical object. You could touch it, you could feel it. There was a different drawer for the fonts. It wasn't just like this big endless menu of fonts. And so that really kind of connected with me. So I started this blog called For Love of Type. Now this is when Google Blogger was kind of the thing to do. Nowadays it's kind of like died out and I haven't updated it in years. But this was kind of the space where I would channel all of my kind of interest in typography. And so I decided to take on this persona of Mrs. Eve. Now does anyone know the story of Mrs. Eve's, the font? Anybody at all? Nobody? Yes, I see a hand. Tell me. Baskerville's what? Lover. Correct, that's right. So the font Baskerville. Everyone, it's the default font I think still in the Mac and systems. So John Baskerville was like this badass type designer in the 19th century, maybe 18th, 19th. And he was socially kind of shunned, not only for his typefaces, because even though nowadays you'd look at it and you're like, oh, it's just a book font, like who cares, whatever. Then it was like the extreme contrast between the thick and thin in his letter forms was considered a little bit outrageous and a bit too modern. But they also were a bit suspicious of his personal life because after his wife died, he fell in love with his housewife, which was this woman called Sarah Eves. And so the rumour goes is that she continued to print his typefaces and his printing that he kind of designed after he died. So in the folklore of typography was one of the first women in the history of type. So Susanna Licco of Emigre designed a font called Mrs. Eves, which is kind of like a little bit more of a feminine version than Baskerville. In 1998. So I kind of came across this story when I was studying. I'm like, that's cool. And I didn't want to write my blog under my name because I was like deep in the type kind of deep dark hole. So I wanted to kind of take on this persona of Mrs. Eves. So in addition to that, I would kind of travel around, in my daily practice and just photograph type in the environment. Sometimes it was pretty straightforward. Building said building on a building, you know? But then I started to become really interested in kind of the undesigned. So you'd have this, you know, handwriting analysis. Obviously it was kind of a psychic place. I think this was in LA, in neon. But then you could have something else that said handwriting analysis. This one's written in glitter and it says scientific. So you know it's legit, right? And so I started to kind of come across different kinds of signs or forms of lettering. I didn't understand what this sign said as I walked into the forest in Japan. It could have said, being danger, don't go any further. But you kind of get a sense of the feeling of what it might be trying to communicate, even without knowing what it says, just purely through the way that the letter forms are treated or the context that they're in. You could say love in this kind of flashy, glamorous way, or you could say love where this was from Clovelly Beach and people from the public have just come and taken away the C and the other L's and left it behind. So the ways that it kind of changes and transforms in a certain environment were really interesting to me. A V shaved out of a dog in Venice Beach. This one here where it's like, you know how the people have their fancy boats and they come up with a name for it, and like, oh, I'm just gonna call this passion, and they've just come and, you know, spray painted it on really quickly. You know, the undesigned can be a source of something that's really authentic and interesting in terms of the way that humans kind of communicate and represent themselves through type. The other thing that interested me was the way that the technology of the time maybe limited or facilitated a particular style. So you see something like this and you've got the steps in there, which may have been at the time a limitation of the medium, and then fast forward a certain number of years and you're trying to recreate this to get like this nostalgic effect. Truth emblazoned across the top of a building in San Francisco, you know, it started to speak to something more. When you think of just letter forms, kind of people don't kind of notice them. They just read the text. But as soon as you kind of enter the design world and you're starting to analyze these things, you can't get out. And this is kind of the state that I was in my early stages of university. The other thing I started to realize is that you have obviously this world of fonts, and nowadays, you know, the language is changing so much that fonts just encapsulates everything from lettering to calligraphy. People will write sometimes on my work, oh, what font is that? And it's clearly a piece of hand lettering. But, you know, I don't think that the way that you call, you know, the terminology that goes along with it really matters, because at the end of the day, it's all different forms of communication. But you have something like this where fonts are kind of really structured, and lettering or handwriting or things that are kind of coming from a different place can say a lot more. Another side of my interest was really in like the history and theory of typography, which eventually led to kind of teaching workshops nowadays. So this was all the kind of stuff that I'd put on my blog. I'd just put it up there, I'd be like, this is really cool, writing as Mrs. Eves. And in addition to that, I was really interested in drawing and illustration. So where I could, I would just kind of fill up these sketchbooks while I was at university, combining lettering and illustration in certain ways. But this was the first kind of bizarre thing that started to get a bit of traction on my blog. No one was really reading it. I think maybe my mum was reading my blog. But I had entered this competition in London for the International Society of Typographic Designers. And as a student, you could like enter your work to become a member. So I'd entered my kind of this thing that I'd designed, went into FedEx, and they didn't send it. So I found out a few days later that the box was still sitting in the FedEx, and I was so angry. I'm like, give me back the box. And I went home and I wrote all these kind of like, it was basically like a letter of complaint written all over the box. And so I put this on my blog and it started to get a bit of traction. People were like, oh, we hate FedEx as well. And so they were kind of reading about typography. And this also kind of started this crazy, frenzied writing all over everything. But this was the big break in the typography world, was this project that I did called Right Here, Right Now, where I wrote all over my body in hand lettering, made a kind of process video that went onto YouTube that went with it. Obviously heavily influenced by Stefan Sagmeister. It was an anti-graffiti campaign, so I thought the idea was like, would you write all over your own body? If not, don't graffiti. So this was kind of a project, I put it online, didn't think anyone was really looking. But meanwhile, over in Germany, this guy right here, Jürgen Siebert, was reading my blog. And I get this email one day from an unknown German man saying, "Dear Gemma, you don't know me, but I thought you might be interested in reading this article that's been written about you on your blog. It's called Amateur Designer and hat Sex mit Buchstaben," which translates to amateur designer has sex with letters. And it basically went on to just be like, who is this Mrs. Eves? Is she a student? Is she a designer? Where is she from? Is she from America? All of her work is copied. Everything's derivative. It's uninteresting. It basically shredded everything that I'd done as a first-year design student at COFA. And so I was just kind of shocked. I was like, oh my God, someone's reading my blog. This is really weird, and didn't think much of it. 3 months later, I get this private message on Facebook from Jürgen Siebert. And he's like, hello, Gemma, you don't know me. I'm like, yes, I do know you. But I basically, since I wrote that article, there was a big backlash in the German design community. And a lot of people disagreed with what I said, and they made an effort to kind of come out and kind of write that on my blog. And there was over 70 kind of comments on his article saying, like, lighten up, dude. And he said, basically, I'm interested in hearing about Australian typography. Would you be interested in coming and speaking at Typo Berlin, which is like a huge design conference over in Germany. I think it was in their 8th or 9th year at the time. He's like, we want you to talk about Australian typography. So I was 21. I hadn't done any commercial work at all. All I had was kind of my over-enthusiastic passion for lettering and type. But I said yes, I was going to come and do it. So here I am with my lapel mic, speaking. I think it was an audience of 1,000 people. I recreated the Right Here, Right Now project with like the full film crew. And instead of talking, I guess, about my work, because I didn't have any work, I interviewed a body of Australian designers and typographers who were working with typography to see if they thought that there was anything that made Australia unique in terms of the typographic style or language that designers used. And one of those people that I interviewed was deFrost.
Typography today and the moving word, pictures, etc. is getting closer and closer to the real life interaction.
So thank you very much for being interviewed. Didn't recall, that was the last time I was here in Frost Studio. So basically I made like a really, it was a student level film that went for about 10 or 15 minutes talking to people about what they thought about Australian typography. So I came back from Berlin, came back to Australia, having kind of gone through this whirlwind experience of kind of being put on the world stage to talk about design, and yet I still didn't really have anything that was my own body of work. So, and I hadn't even graduated from uni. So I came back and, I finished uni and I worked in a variety of like non-hand lettering type-based design professions. So I worked at Animal Logic, which did Happy Feet, 3D animation kind of studios, doing art direction for 3D. So I'd do sketches and then the team would make stuff like this. I worked on the new title sequence for Play School, which was all 3D animation as well, which is so bizarre now when I think about the work and the things that make my work kind of unique to me. Kind of doing really basic graphic logos for ABC Kids shows. And then in one of my jobs where I was working at Fuel, same kind of world, this job came up for Taronga Zoo. And the brief was to kind of have something that was handmade, watercolor treatment. And the idea was that it was a campaign for the wild. So the public was encouraged to come and put a handprint, kind of pledging for the wild and translating the zoo from being a zoo to being a conservation centre. So I basically directed this campaign working with one other animator and did all these kind of illustrations by hand with watercolour. And it was at this moment where I was like, wait a minute, what am I doing working in a 3D animation studio? I need to go back to working by hand. So this was the project that changed everything.
A mark in ink. Still the simplest way to put your name to a letter, a petition, to a contract, to a cause. Our cause is the wild. Every living wild animal. Because we believe that we all, humankind and animals, have a future together. We believe in a world that we can share. A world where all our wild species can make a comeback. Where the wild can remain wild. And we believe for this future to become reality, one species must lead us there. Ours. Taronga for the wild.
So after this project finished, I ended up going out on my own and kind of freelancing, and this was kind of, I guess, the catalyst for realising that this was the kind of work that was more in the direction of what I wanted to be doing. But the best thing that came out of that project was that one of the giraffes got transported from the zoo, and my friend's messaging me one day, she's like, Gemma, did you see that giraffe going down the highway? And I'm like, what are you talking about? So I went online, it was everywhere, across Twitter, it was on the news in America. I'm like, oh my God, there's a giraffe going down the highway. And then I was like, oh my God, it's got my typography on it. So it was like the best, you know, like advertising campaign for me ever. Baby giraffe enjoys the ride. I think its name was Katoto or something. So that was kind of like the turning point for me. To kind of returning as well, I guess, to this idea of authentic craft. So what was it that I was interested in terms of developing my skills? What kind of voice did I want to have? But also going out into the freelance world, there's obviously the commercial demands of actually being able to pay the rent. Now, this was my studio space before I converted it into a studio space. This was a house party that we had. It was over at my attic in Redfern. I don't know who this person is drinking directly out of that bottle of Bacardi, but you can see here the kind of archway shapes. So over the next 3 years, I kind of translated it from being this kind of party room into a very messy kind of creative space. I didn't even have I was still working off my laptop at this stage, to ta-da, like professional-ish looking design studio. So this is basically still where I work and live over in Redfern. And you know, it changes depending on the project that I'm working on. There's a lot of indoor plants, the ones that I've worked out which can survive with the least attention. And it's basically where I now work on commercial projects for anything from advertising clients to logos for bands, and then more art-based projects for myself. This is a picture out the window at, I think it was 5 o'clock in the morning one summer morning, and that's kind of the standard thing that I used to do in my practice, was I'd work from midnight till 4 a.m. and that was when I'd get most of the work done. So, you know, at this time I was repped by Jackie Winter Group in Melbourne and starting to do a lot of really kind of commercial typographic jobs, like this one for Woolworths, Where Every Fresh Christmas Begins. Sometimes I'd work with existing fonts and all I'd need to do is kind of come in and add a few flourishes to make like a unique tagline for this brand art line. Also working in kind of more editorial illustration, so starting with a sketch, moving through to Photoshop. This was for Nautilus magazine, which was an article based on Genius. And then a lot of kind of this world of hand lettering, which was becoming increasingly popular. You know, there were so many commissions that were coming through for, you know, magazines or brands that wanted something that was unique. Even if it was just kind of a tagline, they wanted it to feel like it was a logo. They wanted to feel like it had extra attention. So, you know, flourishes, any kind of embellishments were all the rage over the last kind of 4 years of commercial work. So this was for Oprah magazine. And then there was the grand chalk trend of 2013. Now, you cannot deny that you didn't see it. Basically, Dana Tanamachi, who is an amazing artist based in Brooklyn, did these giant kind of chalk-based murals and work, and then every art director across the planet was like, I want that. And so 80% of my kind of commercial work for a couple of years was coming through these kind of imitating a chalk type feeling. And this was when I really started to think about this idea of why do brands want something to feel human? Why does suddenly everybody, McDonald's, soup brands, wine brands, want something in chalk? Like, this is an old, outdated kind of lo-fi technology, and yet these brands are paying big money to have professional artists recreate it. There was all you need is coffee, you know, so it kind of started happening, and I started to realize that it was this idea of crafting authenticity. It wasn't that it was real. This particular job back here, which was for this wine company, basically, you know, they wanted to make it feel like these artists just suddenly came in and painted, you know, drew this thing in chalk. But the idea behind it was that it was so built up, there was so much organization, there was nothing effortless about it at all. So it was really about creating something that felt somehow human, but that in reality wasn't really real. And I think that for a while, people kind of were like, yeah, okay, that's cool, that I like this brand, or it feels like something in the food world or the drinking world. You want something that feels human. But, you know, people become pretty savvy to the way that advertising companies work, and now you can start to see it kind of shift. So after the chalk went away, there was brush lettering. And so then I started to do a whole heap of brush lettering. And so this job I did for Angus and Julia Stone was for their word mark for their latest album. And I did a few really rough sketches of this one. This was one of the rough sketches initially, and I said, choose which one you like and I'll move on to the final version. And so I did this one, and then I moved on. I didn't like that this was fatter than this was thinner. And so, you know, things like calligraphically that I'd started to become attuned to that I didn't really like, I fixed up. And then she said, no, Gemma, I really like this version. And I'm like, she's like, I like it that it's a bit mistake. You know, she liked it as being inconsistent. So, you know, that's the kind of thing that makes it human, the fact that that's not the same thickness as that. So even though calligraphy can give you this touch of the human, sometimes it's too neat. You can't be too perfect. The other big trend was letterpress. So, and I mean, it's still happening. If you're going to get married, if you don't have letterpress, you know, printed wedding invitation, it's not real, all right? And the thing with letterpress printing is that back in the day when, you know, letterpress printing was kind of the norm, the idea of having an indent in the page was considered to be a poor printing practice. You wanted it to be smooth. And yet nowadays, if it doesn't have the indent, you don't know that it's letterpress printed. So everyone's like, oh, can we get it a bit deeper in, you know? Sign painting has had a huge revival. Lines & Co., which are commercial artists, they're repped by the same agency as me. This was a collaboration I did with them where I designed the type and they hand painted it. But it's not just here locally, it's all around the world. There's a huge resurgence in these kind of handmade techniques. And so, you know, as I started to get more and more commercial commissions, they were like, oh, we want it, can you add a bit more texture in there? Can we see the brushstroke? And you're kind of adding in mistakes almost. I started to realize that I was like kind of a puppeteer to make brands feel more human. And so then kind of the basic things that I would learn in my craft or I would experiment with lost a little bit of meaning. So for me, it was about returning to like the form and the process. So the form of the letters, experimenting with drawing and writing were the two kind of areas that I was kind of wanting to, you know, extend myself within. So there was always, I guess, a passion in the early stages of my design degree before I really got into type, illustration and kind of detailed work. So I started to combine this together with letter forms, or numerals in this case, to make the letter forms into a picture in themselves. So it's not just about the type, but it kind of becomes an image. You don't need to have a photograph and text. It could just work purely with the typography with illustrated elements within it. This was for my recent solo exhibition, so really trying to find ways to combine type with illustration. Also looking beyond the computer for starting points. It's so easy to kind of go on to Tumblr and Instagram or just open Photoshop or Illustrator and have a place to start. But I realized that the more and more that I started to work by hand or to find points from outside kind of the computer as my starting point, it would lend myself in new directions. So this was for a Spanish magazine, like an editorial illustration. And so then taking on these new, you can be translated across different kind of forms as well, just combining that kind of illustrative detailed element into the letter forms. Even working, you know, this was in Illustrator, this was for a Ouija board, this was for an exhibition that was all kind of woodcut, laser cut illustrations. Someone said to me once, like, Gemma, you don't have the goodbye that big. That's like bad for when you have a Ouija board. You don't want to be kind of being sent off. So kind of combining as well this kind of like process where it took a lot of time. I'd kind of start with kind of like maybe a Photoshop kind of mock-up of different type styles, print it out, redraw it, spend a lot of time in the detail. And this was kind of the way in of combining art and illustration and making it sit somewhere in between this kind of world of commercial art, but also something that felt to me personally like it required a bit of dedication and kind of detailing in it. Returning to like, you know, techniques that I hadn't used since art school and in high school. This was for creative mornings. The theme for the kind of morning talk was ink. So I did a giant lino print. And then after kind of about a few years of working, you know, purely in this world of commercial work, pursuing drawing and kind of illustration, I started to want to find something that was a little bit faster, a little bit more kind of fluid in the process. And I'd seen these kind of calligraphy videos, I'd seen these brush lettering artists that I loved, and I wanted to kind of learn that skill myself. So I kind of just started to pick up different tools, brush pens, different calligraphy nibs, and I never had a formal training in, you know, traditional copperplate calligraphy or anything like that, but I just started to experiment with practicing over and over again. So in between my commercial work, I'd stay out really late, making lo-fi cola pens, experimenting with different sized brushes, bunches of twigs, different like custom cut balsa wood, and really just kind of experimenting with different ways of creating letter forms. And what started to happen was, as the more and more I kind of experimented, I'd put it up on my Instagram, and then a client would see something like, oh, we really like that, can you create this? And so this kind of experimental phase of exploring new tools and techniques was then translating into the commercial world. So I was like, oh, I found this new thing that's like authentic and it's real, and it's like, actually, can we use that to put on this campaign? And so again, it was like weighing up between like that commercial side and then the art side of your practice as well. And so much of it was kind of experimenting with texture and movement, and it was fast. You know, it was an immediate way of creating letter forms compared to this kind of labored illustration that I was doing before. So now it's kind of like combined together, and I've got both of them working in tandem. And so what this kind of experimentation led to was this first big job using large-scale brush lettering, which was for Kieran Cider. And so they basically commissioned me to hand paint 37 billboards that they were then going to go install across Sydney. So the idea was, it's like there's a new beer in Richmond or a new cider in Royston Park. So initially the sketches were done with balsa wood, and then the large-scale painting was done using an existing font, but they wanted it to feel like it was hand-painted. So this was the first time I'd ever worked large-scale, and they sent me up in Surrey Hills to do one of them in real life. So I had to go up in a scissor lift and kind of hand paint this. And of course, again, with this idea of authenticity and brands wanting to cling on to an idea of an artist, everything now has a behind the scenes video, and that becomes part of what's used to sell it. Because as I said before, with the robot, you don't know what made it. So if you can see the person doing it, you're more convinced that this is a legitimate, real thing, and therefore I'm going to spend more money on it. But the funniest thing about this job was that the day that I started painting, it was raining, and I wasn't allowed to go up in the scissor lift by myself because I didn't have my scissor lift license. So they had to send this big guy who had his scissor lift license up with me. But the guys shooting the campaign were like, oh, we really want this shot of Gemma at the end just painting by herself, like without that big guy standing next to her, holding the umbrella. And so he's like, it's okay, I'll lie down. So here he is. And it was like he was literally in a pool of water. And so he was a cool dude. So since then, I've actually done a few jobs and I've got my own scissor lift license, so I no longer need this guy. But one of the things that the scissor lift license teacher guy said to me was, he's like, you know what's funny? He's like, over the last 5 years, you know, it used to just all be people, you know, people painting buildings or constructing things. Now, everyone wants their scissor lift is an artist, you know? So there's been this big shift, not only in this kind of the chalk lettering, the letterpress, the sign painting, but also large-scale murals is becoming, you know, the next big thing. And this is what kind of happened when I started to work large scale from that job. Everything that I would kind of start off small would then become big. And advertising agencies, studio spaces would commission me to kind of create hand-painted murals for their spaces. And so essentially, you know, this was again like a new world for me in terms of starting with drawing, moving into more calligraphic approaches, and then moving large scale. It was a new set of skills. And essentially the way that I would design was the same. So I'd still start drawing by hand and then usually just use a projector and work large scale. But the actual process of painting ended up being quite therapeutic. So this was kind of like the last year, the majority of my work has been a lot of large scale murals. This was for a shared common room space in Surrey Hills. And then I've also been working a lot with Volcom as a brand ambassador for their kind of creative projects. And so this was also a space where I started to do these large-scale murals, often in very temporary type contexts. So this was a mural that I did for a film screening they had in Sydney last year. It took me, I think, 2 days to paint, was up for 24 hours, and the next day it was painted white again. And so I started to I actually quite liked the idea that something was transient, or it was only there for a short amount of time, and also wanted to kind of integrate that into my own personal work. So this was for Powder Mountain over in Utah, which ended up getting covered in snow. And so I did start to do kind of, over that time, a lot more large-scale work. And so I guess then the other idea of kind of creating some kind of craft that's unique to you is that I always wanted to do art shows in between all the commercial work. And it wasn't necessarily because I wanted to be a contemporary artist, because I liked the commercial side, but I think it's a necessary thing that you need to do to be able to push the kind of commercial world, and it's like an ongoing progress. I think that you have to kind of evolve to be able to push the trends, because it happens so quickly and ideas are like disseminated so quickly that to create something new, you have to create personal work and you have to do personal projects. And so this kind of like followed on from this large scale work and kind of the idea of working with something that was only up for a short period of time. So this was up for a month in Melbourne. And then at the end, this one I actually got to paint over myself in white, which was quite therapeutic. And I was like, Gemma, oh my God, that's like, how can you do that? But, you know, after laboring over it for weeks, doing these tiny little dots, to get rid of it, and I think as a creative, you immediately hate the thing that you do as soon as you finish it. So to be able to cover it in white is awesome. And also kind of translating that kind of quick brush style into a large-scale mural. This one said, "The experience is everything," which was for Smith Optics in Portland recently. And, you know, even that content in itself is exactly true to our time. Everything's about experience. It's not about objects anymore. Companies want to invest in things where you can go in and be there, document it, share it with everyone. You know, that's the time that we're in at the moment. And so I guess also with my own personal work, wanting to push that level of detail that you can do at a large scale as well. So this was actually just across the street at China Heights a few months ago, my most recent solo exhibition. And this was an installation that I did as part of Art and About. This was kind of like a 4-panelled structure that was in Darling Harbour. And the final project that I want to share with you kind of comes out and is in that world of what I was showing you earlier with Eric Marinovic's work with the illustrations on the, you know, the envelopes and the things that kind of get the most traction in your work. You think, oh, I love this, and you put something out there, you're like, this is my best thing I've ever done, and everyone's like, meh, whatever. And then you do something, you don't think anything of it, and it's just like the most popular thing ever. And that's what happened with this. So basically, I was flying to New Zealand, and I was, you know, it was my first break from doing a whole heap of commercial work, and there was a little sick bag sitting there, and I thought, oh, I'm going to draw on the sick bag. So because it was New Zealand and it was a sick bag, I wrote fully sick. I landed over in Wellington and I get this call from my mum. She's like, Gemma, are you okay? Because I'd put it on Facebook and I'm like, yeah, why? She's like, your dad just called. He said you put something online. You're not feeling very well. I'm like, Mum, I'm like, it's a joke. And I'm like, have you even seen it? She's like, oh, and she looked at it, she burst out laughing. So my dad was a bit late to the game. But then every time I flew, and it was at the time I was flying quite a lot for work, I would think of another puke pun and draw it on the flight. So there was Queasy Lover, Bile High Club, License to Ill. Then they started to kind of coincide with pop culture things that were happening at the time. Daft Punk released Get Lucky, so there was Daft Punk, Get Chucky. This was when I went to Japan, Land of the Rising Lunch. And they just went on and on. So basically, after about 6 or 7 of these, I decided that it was a good time to change my pseudonym from Mrs. Eves to Mrs. Heaves. And so I started to sign them all with Mrs. Heaves, and I started the hashtag SpewBag Challenge. And so I encouraged everyone on Instagram who was following up, said, you can do it as well. So basically the rules were that you had to think of your puke pun, you had to draw it in the time of the flight. So if it was like a 1-hour flight, you had to do something really quick. If it was a long haul flight, you could do something more detailed. And then you had to leave it in the seat for an unsuspecting sick passenger. So I started to put these, more and more were coming along, and then if you look on Instagram now, there's like 1,000, I think, of people all around the world writing puke puns on sick bags. But they kept on going, and even though I did stick to the rules and leave them in the seat initially, after it was starting to get so much of a following, I thought I better keep these and do something with them. But they kept on going for the rest of that year. There was 50 Shades of Spray. This one I gifted to my mum. Chuck Norris needed no alteration. Alice in Chunderland, Bigger Than Ben Hurl. I'd been wanting to use nausea for so long, and when this happened, it was like the greatest moment ever. And this was the last one I did, Saturday Night Heaver. So basically, after probably about 2 years, I'd kind of collected this set. I decided to have an exhibition of them. It was called You Make Me Sick, because there was 24 framed spew bags. The original ones that I'd left in the seats, I recreated them from the images and created some new ones for the exhibition as well. There was Rage Against the Cuisine. So if you want to have a look at all the ones that I've done, there's spewbagchallenge.tumblr.com, and if you do think of a new pun, you can look on the Instagram hashtag, and there's just so many of them, and there's still, I mean, I used to do it every time I flew, and then I realised I literally had made no time in my life for relaxation, so I kind of had to stop and watch the movies, but you can do it if you get a chance. And that's the end. Thanks for having me.